When Hollywood legend Morgan Freeman appears on a live talk show, he anticipates a respectful dialogue. However, the host starts asking tactless and bold questions. Instead of losing his composure, Freeman responds in a way that stuns everyone present. His calm yet profound words turn the situation around, leaving the room frozen in silence. This unforgettable episode proves why Morgan Freeman remains one of the most respected figures in the industry. The tension in the studio was palpable, every seat taken, millions of viewers at home eagerly awaiting the wisdom of a man whose voice had narrated life itself. At 86 years old, he was still witty, graceful, and revered. He stepped onto the stage slowly, greeting the audience with his familiar deep voice. People applauded, some wiping tears from their eyes. But as he settled into his seat, something felt off. The host, Vanessa Clark, known for her bold, often harsh approach, was ready for battle. Morgan had faced countless interviews, but this evening was different. She leaned forward, her red lips curling into a smirk. "So, Morgan," she said, her voice soft yet sharp, "at your age, don't you wake up wondering if this day might be your last?" The room fell silent. Smiles vanished. Morgan didn't flinch. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at her. A storm was brewing, and Vanessa had no idea what she had just started. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some exchanged glances, others shifted in their seats. Vanessa smirked as if the question were trivial. Morgan, however, remained still, his wise, all-knowing eyes fixed on her. She pressed on, tilting her head. "You've played God, but let's be honest, you're just a human, a very elderly human. What's it like knowing your time is nearly up?" Gasps echoed. An elderly woman in the front row pressed a hand to her chest. Morgan sighed softly, shaking his head. He'd spent decades in Hollywood, seen arrogance, cruelty, disrespect. But this was different. Vanessa was relishing it. The camera zoomed in on his face, his expression unreadable, but inside he was reflecting. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every elderly person watching, every soul dismissed, devalued, as if they no longer mattered. And when he spoke, the world listened. Morgan leaned forward, hands clasped. "Miss Clark," he said, his voice steady yet piercing, "have you ever sat with someone as they took their final breath?" The audience froze, chills running down their spines. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. "Well, she stammered, but Morgan didn't let her finish. "I have," he said quietly, "many times." The silence in the room was deafening. His voice carried the weight of 1,000 memories. "I've held the hands of dear friends as they whispered their last words," he continued. "I've watched great people depart forever. And do you know what they regretted most?" Vanessa swallowed. "They didn't regret money or fame. They regretted not loving more, not forgiving more, not cherishing life more." The camera panned to the audience. Tears glistened in some eyes. Morgan looked at Vanessa as if peering into her soul. "You ask what it's like to be old?" he said. "It's a privilege denied to many." The room erupted. Some stood, clapping through tears, but Morgan wasn't done, and Vanessa, for the first time in her career, was speechless. Vanessa Clark sat frozen, clutching her cue cards as if they were her last lifeline. The studio was silent, the audience holding their breath. Morgan's words lingered in the air like an unshakable truth. "It's a privilege denied to many." Somewhere in the crowd, a woman dabbed at tears. A man in his 70s clenched his fists, as if recalling a loss. Vanessa forced a laugh, but it sounded shaky. "Well, Morgan, you're quite the storyteller," she said. "But let's be frank. People your age become irrelevant in Hollywood, don't they?" The audience gasped. Morgan sighed, leaning back, rubbing his fingers, a habit when he was deep in thought. He looked at her, not with anger, not with offense, but with pity. Then he spoke. My dear, allow me to tell you a story. The audience leaned in. When Morgan Freeman speaks, you listen. There was once a young man, he began, his voice thick with emotion, full of dreams, full of life. He thought the world would always be his. But time has a way of humbling us. The room was still. One day that young man grew old. He found that the world that once cheered for him had forgotten him. They no longer saw him, no longer listened. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth, tears welling up. But one night, Morgan continued, he sat by his window, watching a storm approach, and he realized something. Vanessa swallowed hard. He realized that even when the sky darkens, even when the world seems to forget, the sun is still there. It burns, it shines, even behind the clouds. A sob was heard, then another. Morgan looked at Vanessa with kindness. So, my dear, he said softly, irrelevance is a label the world tries to place on those who've lived long enough to carry wisdom. But wisdom never fades. Vanessa's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, but for the first time in her career, she had no words. The camera panned across the audience. An elderly man wiped his face with a handkerchief. A young woman squeezed her grandmother's hand. People weren't just watching, they were feeling. Vanessa shifted, cleared her throat. That was quite a speech, Morgan, she said awkwardly. Morgan gave a faint smile. It wasn't a speech, Vanessa. It was the truth. She took a deep breath, then smirked. Let's change the subject. Your childhood, your mother, a cleaner, your father left when you were a child. Tell me, Morgan, didn't you ever resent having to climb harder than others? The room tensed. It was a harsh question, but Morgan just smiled, knowing what was coming. And when he spoke, the world would never forget. Vanessa's words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Your father left when you were a child? Didn't you resent that? The audience froze. Morgan Freeman sat calmly, his eyes deep, thoughtful. In his silence lay 86 years of wisdom. Vanessa smirked, thinking she'd cornered him. But Morgan smiled. And in his legendary voice, he said, My father left, yes. My mother worked as a cleaner. Do I resent it? No, Vanessa. I'm grateful to them. The audience leaned in. His voice was steady, but it carried unshakable strength. My father taught me something valuable. He showed me the kind of man I didn't want to become. And my mother, he paused, his eyes gleaming, she taught me how to survive. A woman in the crowd sobbed quietly. Vanessa blinked. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. Morgan leaned toward her, locking eyes. You see, Vanessa, pain is a teacher, and it taught me well. The room fell silent, for once again, Morgan turned pain into wisdom. A sob echoed, then another. Vanessa grew uneasy. The atmosphere had shifted. Morgan Freeman, a man who'd endured loss and hardship, sat across from her, not as a victim, but as a victor. You asked if I resent my past, he continued softly. I carry it with me every day, but not as a burden. He paused, his deep voice filling the room with emotion. I carry it as a reminder that I'm still here. An elderly man in the front row bowed his head, shoulders trembling. A woman whispered, God, that's beautiful. Morgan sighed, tapping his fingers on the armrest. The problem with today's world, Vanessa, is that too many look at their past with bitterness. But I look at mine, and I give thanks. The audience burst into applause, some crying openly. Vanessa bit her lip, losing grip on the interview. She hadn't anticipated this, and she certainly wasn't ready for what Morgan would say next. Vanessa exhaled sharply. She was losing control of the conversation. She'd intended to make Morgan Freeman uncomfortable, to break him, but instead she was the one teetering. She straightened up, trying to reclaim her confidence. Morgan, she said with forced boldness, don't you ever feel afraid? You're 86 years old. You've had a great career, but time spares no one. A cruel question, but Morgan smiled. Then he leaned in, and what he said next shook the world. Vanessa, he said softly, do you know the difference between fear and faith? The room went still. Vanessa blinked. What? Morgan's voice was like a warm embrace. Fear is believing in the worst that might happen. Faith is hoping for the best. Tears rolled down a woman's face. Every morning, Morgan continued, I wake up and choose faith. Vanessa swallowed. The power in his words was undeniable. For the first time in her career, she had nothing to say. For the first time, Vanessa Clark was out of words. Morgan Freeman had spoken a truth that pierced the soul. Fear is believing in the worst. Faith is hoping for the best. The audience was in pieces. Some covered their mouths, holding back emotions. Others wept openly. Vanessa glanced around, visibly rattled. She'd wanted to steer the talk, put him on the defensive, but he'd turned the interview into something far greater than herself. The camera zoomed in on an elderly woman in the front row, tears streaming down her face. Morgan noticed her, smiled warmly. You understand, don't you? He asked gently. The woman nodded, hands trembling, whispering, yes. Morgan turned back to Vanessa. You see, Vanessa, wisdom isn't about age, it's about perspective. When you learn to embrace life instead of fearing its end, you become truly alive. The room erupted in applause, people clapping through tears, and Vanessa, for the first time, felt fear of what would come next. Vanessa shifted in her chair. She was losing control, and she knew it. Her producers in the control room were likely wondering why she hadn't cut him off. But she had no choice. The moment belonged to Morgan Freeman. Desperate to regain the upper hand, she forced a laugh. All right, Morgan, enough wisdom. Let's talk legacy. What do you think people will remember about you when you're gone? The room went quiet again. A cold, direct question, but Morgan chuckled softly. Oh, Vanessa, he said, shaking his head. You're asking the wrong question. Vanessa frowned. What do you mean? Morgan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It doesn't matter what people will remember about me when I'm gone. What matters is what they'll remember about you. The audience gasped. This was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning. And for the first time in her life, Vanessa Clark felt small. Vanessa stared at him. The cameras, the lights, the audience, all faded. Morgan's words hit her like a thunderbolt. What matters is what they'll remember about you. She'd always asked the tough, ruthless questions, but now she was forced to look within. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Morgan leaned back, giving her space, his eyes kind yet piercing. You see, Vanessa, he said softly, I've spent my life telling stories, helping people feel, helping them understand. And when my time comes, I know I'll leave something meaningful behind. The audience listened in utter silence. But you, he paused, you have a platform, a powerful voice, yet you use it to tear people down. A stifled sob came from the crowd. Vanessa looked down, gripping her cue cards tightly. Morgan sighed, his voice softening. But it's not too late. You can choose a different path. A tear slid down her cheek, and in that moment, the world watched her break. Vanessa sat motionless, her fingers trembling slightly. For the first time in her career, she was vulnerable. Morgan's words hadn't just touched her, they'd pierced her soul. It doesn't matter what they'll remember about me. What matters is what they'll remember about you. The studio was silent, but inside Vanessa's mind, chaos reigned. She'd built a career exposing others, asking questions no one dared to. But now she had no answer. A tear fell onto her cue card. Morgan noticed, sighed, and spoke in that deep, gentle voice. You see, Vanessa, people think power comes from how loudly they speak. But true power, real strength, comes from knowing when to listen. A woman in the audience sobbed openly. Vanessa exhaled, her breath shaky, for the first time forced to listen, and it was tearing her apart. The audience was stunned. This wasn't the Vanessa Clark they knew. She'd always been in command, dominating every conversation, but now she looked small, fragile, human. A tear dropped onto her card. Morgan's eyes softened. Vanessa, he said gently, you've spent years sitting across from people, asking them hard questions. But have you ever sat with yourself and asked the same? She exhaled sharply, fighting tears. She'd exposed others, but now she was the one laid bare. She whispered, her voice breaking. Morgan leaned forward like a father to a child. It's never too late. Vanessa squeezed her eyes shut, a deep sob escaping her lips, and in that moment, the world watched her fall apart live on air. The studio fell silent for a moment, then one clap, another, a third, and suddenly the entire audience was on its feet. People wept openly. Some hugged strangers beside them. Others stood, hands over their hearts. Even the camera crew wiped their eyes. Vanessa, overwhelmed, pressed her hand to her chest. Morgan, you've just changed my life. Morgan chuckled, his voice warm and rich. No, my dear, you changed it yourself. The applause grew louder. The energy in the room shifted. This was no longer a talk show. It was a moment in history, one no one would ever forget. Morgan Freeman rose slowly, the audience unrelenting in their applause. He nodded to Vanessa with a knowing look, then turned to the crowd. My friends, he said, his voice brimming with emotion, I've lived many years. I've seen pain, I've seen loss, but I've also seen something stronger than all of that. He paused, gazing at the tear-streaked faces. I've seen love. A wave of emotion swept the room. Morgan smiled. So if you take anything from here tonight, let it be this. Go home, call someone you love, forgive someone you've been angry with, tell the people who matter that they matter. A woman in the front row broke down in sobs. Vanessa covered her mouth, holding back her own tears. Morgan turned to her one last time. You asked about my legacy. This is it. And with that, he walked off the stage, leaving behind a world forever changed. The studio fell silent for a moment, then one clap, another, a third, and suddenly the entire audience was on its feet. People wept openly. Some hugged strangers beside them. Others stood, hands over their hearts. Even the camera crew wiped their eyes. Vanessa, overwhelmed, pressed her hand to her chest. Morgan, you've just changed my life. Morgan chuckled, his voice warm and rich. No, my dear, you changed it yourself. The applause grew louder. The energy in the room shifted. This was no longer a talk show. It was a moment in history, one no one would ever forget. Morgan Freeman rose slowly, the audience unrelenting in their applause. He nodded to Vanessa with a knowing look, then turned to the crowd. My friends, he said, his voice brimming with emotion, I've lived many years. I've seen pain, I've seen loss, but I've also seen something stronger than all of that. He paused, gazing at the tear-streaked faces. I've seen love. A wave of emotion swept the room. Morgan smiled. So if you take anything from here tonight, let it be this. Go home, call someone you love, forgive someone you've been angry with, tell the people who matter that they matter. A woman in the front row broke down in sobs. Vanessa covered her mouth, holding back her own tears. Morgan turned to her one last time. You asked about my legacy. This is it. And with that, he walked off the stage, leaving behind a world forever changed. If this story touched your heart, like this video to share this powerful message. Comment below which of Morgan's words hit you the hardest. Subscribe so you never miss another story that will stir your soul. And remember, life is not measured by the years we live, but by the love we give.